This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Roy Yanong, speaking to you from the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory in Ruskin, Florida. Thanks for joining us. Florida has been the center of aquarium fish and plant production in the United States since the 1930s. The state's fish farmers currently raise hundreds of species of ornamental fish. But how do they breed all these different species? Most people know guppies give birth to fairly developed young fish, but do they know how guppies actually breed? And what about all the other species? My guest today is a good friend and colleague, Craig Watson, director of the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory. Although Craig has worked in many different areas of aquaculture, he has always had an obsession for aquarium fish sex, figuring out what it is that makes fish want to breed, and it's not just all about soft lights and music. He's helped many farmers crack the secrets of the intimate world of fish, and will share some fascinating stories with us today. Join us.
We'll be right back, right after these messages. Stay tuned.
It's designerpetsweaters.com. Hand-knitted designer sweaters for your precious pup or cool cat. Beautiful couture patterns for your pets, including custom-knitted formal wear, casual wear, yachting, and even sports-themed. Many designer pet sweaters include feathered tammy hats, top hats, and a lot of sparkle. Each sweater includes leg loops, front paw sleeves, and leash opening. Visit designerpetsweaters.com to order your four-legged fashions today. Your pets will stay warm for the winter and be runway ready. Large or small, we fit them all. designerpetsweaters.com.
Let's talk pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. My guest today is a good friend and colleague, Craig Watson, Director and Research Coordinator of the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory, and one of the biggest fish heads I know. Hey, Craig, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, no problem. Enjoyed it.
So, you are into sex, and we're going to talk more about that in a second, but I wanted to talk a little bit about your background, because it's actually pretty interesting. So, if you can think back eons, I guess, maybe hundreds of years ago, to your earliest memory, how did you first get interested in the aquarium hobby, and what was your first fish and aquarium setup?
Well, Columbus and I sailed over from Europe, and no, I was a little kid, and we lived in Puerto Rico on an Air Force base, and my parents got us a little 5-gallon aquarium, my older brother and I. And we sold a bunch of toys in the neighborhood to get money to go to the pet shop, and we bought some swordtails. And the day we brought them home that night, one of the swordtails had babies. And that was it. It's been addiction ever since.
You worked on a fish farm when you were young also. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and how it influenced you?
I was in high school, and a good friend of mine, Danny Roberts, his father owned one of the largest fish farms in Florida at the time, Roberts Fish Farm. And I got a job after school and during the summer working on the fish farm there. Started out siphoning tanks and counting fish and running to and fro, getting stuff for everybody else. And after a couple of years, started breeding their African cichlids. And that's how I got interested in commercial production of fish.
And you stayed pretty fishy even in college, too. What did you do in college that was fish-related?
There was a pet shop in town that was exclusively fish, and by badgering the owner repeatedly, I was able to get a job there and paid my way through college working at a fish store.
So how did you go from aquarium fish then to 3 years in the Peace Corps?
Well, got out of college at Florida State with a bachelor's degree in biology, which was pretty darn worthless at the time. Ended up getting a job at a wholesale operation, wholesaling tropical fish out of Riverview. But the hours were long and the work was tough, and decided that I wanted to do something else, and the Peace Corps was an option that we looked at, and my wife and I joined the Peace Corps. Spent 3 years in North Africa, where I also worked at a fish hatchery. doing marine food fish.
So you stayed fishy anyway in the Peace Corps.
Stayed fishy, yes.
So after all of that, how did you end up working back in Florida?
Got out of the Peace Corps, went to Auburn University to get my master's degree. And as I was finishing up, a job announcement came across my boss's desk. He was the extension specialist there, advertising for an extension agent in Florida, working with the tropical fish industry, which I jumped all over and started working for the University of Florida in 1988.
So you've been involved for very, very many years. How has the industry changed since the good old days back when you were a kid?
Well, in some ways it's gotten a lot better. Production is certainly more sophisticated, and in some ways the fish are better fish because people are more expert in taking care of their fish. In other ways, though, it's changed in that it's not quite as personable as it used to be. There used to be a lot more farms, and therefore there were a lot more people selling fish. And so the market was pretty wide open and gave almost everybody an opportunity to find a niche within that market and produce fish that they could sell. Now it's the distribution and production have all been consolidated quite a bit, and we don't have as many farmers and not as many people shipping fish. So the markets are kind of limited, and so it's a little less personable. Let me put it that way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think a lot of the other industries have seen something very similar, kind of a lot of consolidation. So that makes sense. But what is your job at the Tropical Aquaculture Lab?
I take care of you. No, I'm the director of the lab, and it's my job to make sure that we still have funding for all the different things that we do, kind of oversee the program to make sure that it stays on track and it's doing what it was meant to do, which is to help the farmers in Florida primarily. And my passion, my research is, and I'm fortunate in that I'm able to still do it, is reproduction of new species.
So you mean sex, right? Fish sex.
Yeah, fish sex. That's
okay.
right.
So besides having to deal with me on a daily basis, what is maybe the other most frustrating part of your job?
Well, we have veterinary interns, and sometimes they can be extremely problematic, like Dan Rothen. I don't know if you remember him, but...
Oh, Dan, of course I remember.
Wait.
Yeah.
That was a joke that we planned. That one was for you, Dan.
Actually, yeah.
Well, there's nothing frustrating about my job.
That's great. Well, I think it's time to talk aquarium fish sex. Many people probably know, as we discussed in the intro, that guppies give birth, and you mentioned swordtails, to these pretty well-developed fish that are able to start feeding right away. But I bet a lot of people really don't know about a lot of the other fish in the fish stores. Can you briefly explain some of the different ways that fish are spawned here in Florida?
Well, you mentioned swordtails. We lump swordtails, mollies, platies, guppies into a group we call live bearers, and those are the common fish that we call live bearers. There are other live bearers, but that's the big four. And those are grown primarily in open ponds where the brood stock are put out, and they drop their babies and they grow them up. A lot of farmers collect the babies and move them to a new pond. Some farmers move the brood stock to a new pond. But that's fairly straightforward, and it's the number of females you put in that determines how many fish you get, primarily.
A more personal fish question. How do they actually breed, though?
The live bearers.
Yeah, the live bearers. I bet people don't really know that.
Well, the male has a fin, and his anal fin is modified in that there's 3 rays on the end of it that fuse together, and they make like a trough. It's a long triangular shaped trough, and it has hooks on the end of it, and they can turn that thing 360 degrees or 180 degrees around facing forward. They put that inside of the female. The hooks hold it in there, and then they transport a sperm packet down that trough and insert it into the female. And then she can actually hold on to that sperm packet for as long as a year, periodically releasing sperm from it to fertilize the eggs that are inside of her. Pretty cool, actually.
It sounds painful. Hooks always sound painful, but we can go on. Go ahead. What are some other common ways that fish are bred here?
I kind of see where you're taking this now, Roy. Well, then there's a whole nother group of fish that we combine into what we call egg layers. And there's a lot of different strategies for how they release, fertilize, care or not care for their eggs. The most basic is what we call egg scatterers. And the male and the female come together in the water column. The female releases a bunch of eggs. The male releases sperm. There's a cloud of sperm around the eggs that fertilizes them, and they go where they will. Sometimes they sink to the bottom. Sometimes they float down the river or the stream and the current. Sometimes they've got an oil droplet and they float to the surface and they float along the surface, but they're just scattered. And you see in those fish, usually they have a lot of eggs because the chances of those eggs surviving and hatching and the larvae growing up are slim when you don't care for them at all. Then we have nest builders, and when I say nest builders, it could be something as simple as cleaning a slate or a flat rock. Angelfish, freshwater angelfish will do that. They'll clean a leaf or they'll clean a rock, and the female lays the eggs in a group, and the male comes along and fertilizes them. Some other fish will do something real similar, but they'll find a cavity, a hole in a log or a little hole in the wall of the bank, and they'll do the same thing. We have fish that we call bubble nest builders that bring together a group of plants a lot of times, but sometimes they don't even need that. The male creates a nest of bubbles that are real sticky, covered with his slime, and the eggs are stuck up in that nest, and he'll sit there and guard that. Some fish make a nest out of plants on the bottom. Then you have another real cool group we call the mouth brooders, where it can be the male or the female will hold the eggs, the fertilized eggs, in their mouth and until the young are ready to swim and protect them in their mouth. The interesting thing here is with the more parental care that you get, usually the fecundity or the number of eggs goes down, because the babies have a much better chance of survival the more the parents care for them. And also the eggs themselves are larger, so that because they don't need as many eggs to successfully reproduce. And then there's some weird oddballs like seahorses, where the males have a pouch or a pad on the sea dragons on their tail. There's another really weird fish that puts the eggs up on top of the head of the male. Fish are pretty creative in how to have sex and how to successfully reproduce, and it depends on where they come from and how they evolved.
So in Florida, where obviously the name of the game is variety and making money for the producers, why is new fish sex so important to the industry? And what, when we say that, what are we talking about?
Well, you mentioned that we produce several hundred varieties of fish. Used to actually be more, but Florida is not alone in producing fish for the aquarium trade. Not only do we have a lot of fish that come from the wild where they're collected, but we also have large, very sophisticated, very competitive farms in other countries that import or export, and we import their fish into the North American market, which is primarily Florida's market in North America. We do export a little bit, but that's our market. So every time that we can successfully start producing a new species of fish here in Florida, it increases the market share for the wholesalers and the farmers in general. There's also typically a window of time in the initial stages of producing a new species where the price is really good because you're the only person or the only few people in town that have them. There's another aspect of the trade, the business, that plays into this, and that's that wholesalers, distributors want to make a phone call or send an email and order as many different fish as they can from one place. So if we now have a neon tetra coming from Florida that means that distributor doesn't have to go to Hong Kong or South America to get them. And as he gets his neon tetras from Florida, he's also getting his swordtails, his plecostomus, and everything else. So adding a new species doesn't just produce the value of that one species. It increases the competitiveness of Florida's industry.
Well, we've got quite a bit more of fish sex to talk about, but we'll have to take a real short break and then continue our discussions with Craig Watson right after these messages from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Dana Humphrey, the founder of Whitegate PR. We have been specializing in PR and marketing in the pet industry for over 10 years. If you have a pet product or service you would like to promote, give us a call. We can help create awareness for your brand on TV, radio, magazines, newspapers, and blogs. Feel free to reach me directly at 619-414-9307 or learn more on our website at whitegatepr.com or follow us on Facebook.
Let's talk pets
Let's talk pets
on Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
We're back and continuing our conversation with my guest, Craig Watson from the University of Florida. So Craig, you talked about a couple really interesting ways fish breed or spawn and the importance of having new species or new ways for breeding fish in the industry. How do you go about deciding which species of fish to work on, and how do you make sure that once you figure these out that all that information will get transferred to the farmers?
Well, since the beginning, we've worked very closely with the industry, with advisory committees and their association board to communicate directly with them on what would they like. So that's the first thing, is listening to the industry to help us make those decisions. But the criteria that we use for new species work is it only imported into the United States? In other words, is it not available in the U.S.? Or if it is available, is it not available in any quantity that would be able to compete with imported species or imported fish? Two is it got a high dollar value, either individually or even better in volume? So we look for fish that have a large market share. And the reason the volume is important, because that allows more than just one or two producers to then use the information that we create through our research and turn it into a business plan. And then we also look at, is it viable? I mean, is it something that we think we can do? We've had some fish that we've worked with for a number of years, only to come back and tell the farmers and the producers that based on our information, we don't think that it's economically feasible to produce that fish on farms here in Florida. So those are the kind of decisions we make.
Well, given all those decisions and obviously a very complicated process to figure it out, well, what are some of the earliest successes you and colleagues at UF, maybe in Gainesville, I guess, had with spawning new species for the industry?
Well, the first one was already underway before I got here, and that was red-tailed black sharks. And that was a fellow named Jim Gilday was doing his master's research with Dr. Shireman, and they worked out the reproductive strategy for red-tailed black sharks using standard hormonal induction processes. And that fish also turned into rainbow sharks and albino rainbow sharks and Pangasius or mystery sharks, tinfoil barbs. There was a whole group of fish that all of a sudden started being produced here in Florida based on that one master student's research project. And what he found was that it's a cyprinid. It's in the minnow group. Was that it responded much like carp do. So using standard aquaculture practices from carp food fish production, they were able to get that fish in production. And that ended up being literally millions of dollars every year to the state of Florida, again, from a simple graduate student's thesis.
So what was the secret to that one, to that group? How do they end up spawning them?
It was just conditioning the females, looking at the eggs to make sure that the eggs were mature. And what we look for there is there's a macronucleus. And when that macronucleus is migrated over toward the side of the egg, we know the eggs are mature. And then using GnRH, which is a gonadotropin releasing hormone with a dopamine inhibitor. And I believe back then they were using a product called Reserpine for that research. But today there's a standard product available from Western Chemicals called Ovaprim, which is essentially the exact same thing, except in an injectable form. And then using hand stripping or spawning in tank techniques to get the eggs out of the female and fertilized by the males.
Were there any other fish early on, or any other fish that...
Another notable one, because this one was done a little differently, was neon tetras. The belief was that you could not produce neon tetras in Florida because we didn't have the proper water, and that the number of eggs that you got per female, the hatch, the survival was so low that there was no way that anybody in Florida could compete with Hong Kong, which is now still the world's largest supplier of neon tetras. They're not coming out of the Amazon like they used to. But again, a very inexpensive and simple research project looked at using water filtration technologies of a softener and a reverse osmosis filter to recreate the extremely soft, low pH water needed for good spawning. And also the trick with neons is to use very young females to start with and to spawn them very regularly. One of the big mistakes that was being made was trying to spawn great big fat female neon tetras that were really too old, and the eggs that they had should have been spawned months before that, and so the spawns were being interfered with because they had all these old bad eggs in them. But now, today, Florida probably, if I had to guess, I'd say we ship 500 boxes a month of, 300 to 400 neons out of the state.
Well, that's definitely a lot of neons, and it seems like there's a lot of little tricks for every type of fish. Now, early in your career, I'm sure you must have had some kind of holy grail fish that people hadn't been breeding or wanted to breed but weren't able to. You'll have to tell us a little bit about the clown loach. I know that was one of your early holy grail fish.
Yeah, you know about that because you were working 5D tropicals when we first started talking about it. The clown loach was a fish that I've always loved, and I had the pleasure of going to Indonesia in 1990 and seeing where they collected them and seeing some big mature clown loaches, and always wanted to put that fish in production. That's a fish that, there's numbers aren't really good, but it's well over 10 million fish a year are sold globally in the aquarium trade. It's just a beautiful little fish, peaceful, brightly colored. But it was kind of like the neon tetras. Everybody said you can't reproduce them, that they won't reproduce, that they only sell males, that they have to be 13 inches long before they're mature. There were just an awful lot of things that people said that made it sound impossible to breed this fish. But we decided that, they breed somewhere, so let's just start looking at them. And it was really interesting in that we really didn't do anything fantastically new or special. Again, it was finding out what are the best conditions to rear the adults in. We found that they like to be left alone in a semi-quiet place. What did the females want to eat or need to eat? And we found that wasn't anything real special. To make good eggs, we were feeding them just a standard commercial diet, a salmon starter diet. And then using the same techniques that we used on the rainbow sharks and the red-tailed black sharks, taking a sample of the eggs, looking at them for maturity, injecting the fish, and stripping the eggs out of them. And now we have 3 farms that have brood stock that are reproducing, and keep hoping any day that we're going to start seeing boxes of clown loaches coming out of Florida. I will say that fish has some problems with larval rearing. The larvae are extremely touchy, and there were several times where we did everything exactly the same way we did at the time before, which was very successful and had, very poor survival. So that fish is still perplexing in that, we can get good females, we can get good eggs, we can get sperm, we can get a hatch, but every now and then we have problems with larval rearing still.
So it's getting closer, but it's still a little bit of a holy grail fish then.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, recently you have received a lot of press about the work you've done with the green spotted puffer. Can you tell us a little bit about the green spotted puffer and some of that work?
Well, that's an interesting story in that, like I said earlier, we work with a group of farmers to help us come up with a list of species that they want us to work with. And green spotted puffers were on that list. And my experience with the green spotted puffers as a hobbyist and working at a pet shop was that it's an aggressive little guy. They've got a nice set of teeth, and they use them to trim the fins of their slow-moving tank mates if they can. And we never really sold that many of them, but one of the major retail chains had started carrying green spotted puffer fish on a regular basis, and so they had a SKU number, and that's the sign that the fish has really got some volume when they give it a SKU number. So we got some green spotted puffer fish, and I wasn't real excited about it, as you can tell from the way I introduced this, but one of the first things we do before we start working with any fish, any new species, we try to do a literature review of what's out there. Has somebody done this before? If they have, what did they do? Why isn't it commercial? And anyway, on green spotted puffer fish, if you do just a simple internet search, you're going to find some hits that'll come back on genome. The word genome will be in there, Human Genome Project. And what I found was that the green spotted puffer fish, Tetraodon nigriviridis, has the world's smallest known vertebrate genome. And during the Human Genome Project, they used this fish as a model to identify vertebrate genes because it's a vertebrate like we are. It has a lot of the same genes that we do. And they've completely mapped the genome for the green spotted pufferfish. And so I started talking to some of these scientists that had been involved with that project, and they, like the farmers and the wholesalers, were limited to wild collected fish from Thailand primarily for their research. They never had learned how to reproduce them. So right away, my interest was piqued in that we might have something that had a value above and beyond the aquarium trade, and that is that we could be the first to have embryos of the world's smallest known vertebrate genome. And the scientists agreed. So we got a lot of interest from a lot of different people, not from the value of this fish as an aquarium fish, but the value of this fish as a science tool. And we now have a producer in Florida that's producing them and has focused on a market supplying them to labs in Canada, another one in California, in Europe. There's still a lot of labs that are looking at this fish for their research. So it was kind of serendipitous that, this fish that I wasn't excited about, but it was on the list, we'll go ahead and work with it, turned out to be one that really established our lab as having a little more than just industry impact, and that we were doing good science and we were of value to the scientific community as well.
So I guess I have to mention, we've got in our diagnostic lab a number of fish that have been painted that represent different people here at the lab, and yours happens to be a green spotted puffer, so I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but
another moment of serendipity, yes.
Exactly, a moment of serendipity. So we've got so much more to talk about. We're running out of time, but I wanted to just ask you if maybe you could briefly mention some of the other fish that you and the staff here, in terms of the most immediate freshwater, brackish water fish you guys have been working with and breeding successfully.
Well, in the last 3 years, Monodactylus seabae, we've got those established. We have a producer with the broodstock on those. Black ghost knifefish, fire eels, we've been able to repeatedly reproduce those. We're working on Pictus catfish. We've been able to spawn them, but we're having some problems with the larvae there. The pufferfish, as you mentioned, and those have since spun off to include figure 8 puffers and dwarf Indian puffers. Yeah.
That's quite a few. So I guess if you had to sum up your sexual experience with fish, do you have any final thoughts or words or ideas for our listeners?
I on a very serious note, fish sex to me is just fascinating. Biology in general and how life works is just fascinating. But the beauty of this, especially working with aquarium fish, is that if you are a student of biology and life, you can learn so much about how it works in a small space with an aquarium. That 5-gallon aquarium is how it all got started. But a lot of the work that we're still doing is being done in small aquariums. And you can just learn an awful lot about how nature has evolved by studying fish reproduction.
Well, those are definitely good and true words of wisdom. And we hope a lot more young kids get involved with aquaria and really learn a lot more about nature through these small ecosystems and learn more about reproduction. Well, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you, Craig, very much, and our producers, especially Mark Winter, for making the show possible. So, Craig, thanks very, very much. Please be sure to check out Craig's web pages. The links are on his Aquariumania bio page. I encourage all of you to visit my Aquariumania blog on Pet Life Radio. You'll find pictures from this episode and or other episodes and can ask questions or make comments. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for a show, email me at drroy@petliferadio.com. That's DRROY@petliferadio.com. If you're ever in Florida, please be sure to visit the Aquariumania exhibit at the Florida Aquarium in Tampa, one of my favorite aquariums. So until next time, please visit your local aquarium stores and keep your tanks clean and your fish healthy. And when you look at a fish in the store, think about it next time. Where did this fish come from and how did it actually reproduce?
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.